There's no sacrifice of the mind required to be religious. Thomas Aquinas, really more than anybody else in the tradition, boldly asks all the questions. If you've got a theologian who says, whether there's a God, well, that means anything's open. That means any question's possible. Good, good. We have nothing to be afraid of. Reason poses no threat to religion when both reason and religion are authentically understood. That's what Aquinas got. And see, without him, we'd be, I think, in a much more confused state of mind. Thomas Aquinas' contribution to the church and to Western culture in general has been so massive, it's difficult even to get a grip on him. He was philosopher, scientist, biblical commentator, theologian, mystic, and above all, a saint. Is that last description, which is at the same time the most overlooked and the most clarifying. If you read Thomas simply as a rationalist philosopher, you'll miss the point of almost anything he wrote. Thomas was a saint, deeply in love with Jesus Christ. He was a spiritual master. And the whole purpose of all his writing was to place us on the road to Christ. Toward the end of his life, Thomas Aquinas was stationed in Naples. In fact, I'm standing right now in the cell that he occupied at the Friary of San Domenico Maggiore. During those years, Thomas was working on the last part of the Summa Theologiae, his theological masterpiece. One of the texts in that last part dealt with the Eucharist, and Thomas had a very special devotion to that sacrament. It's moving to me to think that in this very place, he was thinking through and writing that text. When he finished, he wasn't entirely satisfied, and he placed the text at the foot of the cross, as though asking for approbation, and a voice came from the cross. Thomas, you've written well of the sacrament of my body. What would you have as a reward? And his splendid reply was, Nil nisi te. I'll have nothing except you. With all his heart, Thomas Aquinas wanted nothing other than Christ. Nothing more or less than Christ. Grasping this is the key to grasping all that he wrote.
Thomas Aquinas was born in 1225 in the family castle of Roccasecca near the town of Aquino, situated about midway between Rome and Naples. His mother, Theodora, was descended from Norman and Neapolitan gentry, and his father, Landulf, was a minor nobleman. Thomas's family was caught up in the confusing and shifting politics of the day, which pitted the Pope against the Holy Roman Emperor. When Thomas was only 5 years old, he was sent to the Benedictine monastery of Monte Cassino, not too far from his home. He would stay among the Benedictines for 9 very formative years. Far too many commentators have overlooked the importance of Thomas's sojourn in the Benedictine world. At Monte Cassino, he would have learned the rudiments of the contemplative life, and he would have fallen in love with the scriptures, especially the Psalms. In his maturity, Thomas would understand theology as essentially an elaboration of the Sacra Pagina, the holy page. There's a delicious story told concerning Aquinas at this early stage of his development. After hearing his teacher discourse on God during an elementary catechism class, young Thomas reportedly said, "But Master, what is God?" He never stopped asking that question his whole life long.
I'm a seminary rector, so I deal with people applying to the seminary all the time. And it's not true in every case, but in a lot of cases, you have these young men that say, yeah, when I was 4, 5, 6, I wanted to be a priest. It was already in my heart, in my mind. So that's not all that unusual. Something else I'd say is, how many swimmers start at 5 or 6? How many skaters start at 5 or 6? How many divers? I started diving when I was 5. And we don't think we're imposing on them or we're violating their autonomy. They perceive some excellence, in that case, some, sports excellence. And by God, they want to get at it because they want to be the best in the world at it. So what's so wrong with saying, I perceive this excellence of friendship with God and I want to get at it right away? It might be our prejudice against religion. There's something psychologically problematic about that. But we don't think it's psychologically problematic to throw a kid into a swimming pool when he's 5 years old and get him up at 5:30 in the morning and get him going in his practice. So I don't know. I think this is more of a prejudice on our part.
When he was around 15, Thomas left Monte Cassino for political reasons and took up what we would call undergraduate studies at the newly founded University of Naples. While in Naples, the teenager became a double radical. Under the influence of his professor, Peter of Ireland, Thomas became a devotee of the Greek philosopher Aristotle, whose writings have been condemned by a number of popes.
Though some of his texts were known in the Christian West, the bulk of Aristotle's corpus, including his treatises on God and metaphysics and the nature of the soul, were just coming into circulation at this time. Many serious Christians felt that Aristotle's view represented a threat to Catholic orthodoxy. But others felt otherwise, including Peter of Ireland, who taught here at the University of Naples. They felt Aristotle represented a breath of fresh air, a new approach to religious questions, more grounded in this worldly reality. In a word, Aristotelianism was an exciting, even dangerous movement in mid-13th century Christendom, and Thomas Aquinas would become one of its most enthusiastic adepts. But the Aristotelian radical became even more countercultural when he embraced the other great revolution of his time, the mendicant movement.
While he was still a university student in Naples, Thomas took the habit of the preaching friars of St. Dominic. Like his contemporary Francis of Assisi, Domingo de Guzman felt that Christianity needed to be revitalized through a return to the radicality and simplicity of the gospel message. And so he gathered around himself a band of brothers dedicated to lives of preaching, poverty, and radical trust in God. For some, the presence of Franciscans and Dominicans was a sign of renewal in the church. But for many others, it was a scandal. Thomas's parents wanted him to be the abbot of Monte Cassino, a respected position at an established institution. The last thing in the world they wanted or expected was that he would join this strange and upstart group of beggars. So, on his way to Paris to begin his Dominican formation, Thomas was waylaid by his own brothers, who had been sent by their mother to stop him. Though they tried to tear his Dominican habit from his back, the young Aquinas clung to it desperately until they stopped. They then locked him away in a family castle in the hopes of dissuading him. It only caused his resolution to deepen. During this time of seclusion, he studied the Bible intensely, memorizing large portions of it. According to a famous legend, his brothers introduced a comely prostitute into Thomas's chambers, hoping to coax him from his celibate commitment. The young Dominican chased the girl from the room, shouting and brandishing a torch. Eventually, his family relented and allowed him to go his way. Thomas traveled with his Dominican companions to the intellectual capital of the Christian world at that time. In the middle of the 13th century, Paris was a magnet for scholars from across Europe. Young students came to the left bank of the Seine, still called to this day Le Quartier Latin, the Latin Quarter, because of the language spoken by these international students. They came to hear lectures from and to argue with the finest scholars of the time.
The Paris style of theologizing, brash, skeptical, public, even a tad irreverent, represented a departure from the more conservative monastic approach. When Thomas Aquinas arrived here in the new Athens of Paris in 1245, he found his intellectual home. He also found the most important of his mentors, the Dominican scientist and philosopher who, even in his own lifetime, was referred to as Albertus Magnus, Albert the Great. Under Albert's tutelage, Thomas continued his underground study of Aristotle.
In 1248, he followed his mentor to Cologne, becoming the great man's apprentice. While a student there, Thomas, taciturn, self-effacing, and by no means slender, was given the nickname the Dumb Ox of Sicily. When Albert heard of this, he remarked, "I assure you that the bellowing of that ox will one day fill the world." Thomas Aquinas was ordained a priest in Cologne, in a predecessor church to the great Cologne Cathedral. In 1252, he returned to Paris in order to commence what we would call today doctoral studies. And in 1256, the 29-year-old Aquinas became a magister of theology and began to lecture. A magister's tasks were laid out clearly. First, he was to preach, for primarily he was a magister sacrae paginae, a master of the holy page. Preaching would conduce naturally toward biblical commentary, and biblical commentary would lead to the searching out of complex theological questions.
These questions, the medievals called them questiones disputate, were not entertained abstractly or simply in the pages of books. They were addressed in the context of very lively public debates. A master such as Thomas Aquinas would announce an upcoming disputatio, and then students and faculty and interested outsiders would gather. The initial part of the discussion was led by a baccalaureus. We call him today a doctoral student. He'd entertain questions, objections, arguments from the floor and respond as best he could. All this time, the magister, the master, was present, but he remained silent. The next day, the same audience would gather, and this time the magister would give his literally magisterial resolution of the question. Then he would respond to what he took to be the best objections from the previous day.
Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologiae, generally regarded as his masterpiece, is a literary rendition of a series of these questiones disputate. A typical article in the Summa begins with a statement of the issue, like the summoning of the quaestio disputata. That is followed by a series of objections, like the comments and questions from the floor, and that is followed by the magisterial resolution of the matter, and finally by an answer to the objections. It is so important to remember the lively background for Thomas's texts as we make our way through them.
So historically, what was so significant about where we're standing?
I'm standing on the Rue de Fouillard, which is in the Latin Quarter. It's a very short street, but it's referred to as the berceau de l'université. That means the cradle of the university. The word fouillard is an older French word that has a sense of like bales of hay or straw, because the students would gather here. They'd put straw on the ground, and they would sit, and their professors would lean out the window or lecture them in the open air. So in the very early days, when the students spilled off the island onto the Quartier Latin, the university hadn't fully developed. That's how it started. So the fouillard gives you the sense of that. Also, right around the corner from here is the Rue Dante, Dante Street, because Dante came here in the very early 14th century, maybe 1302 or something. And he would have sat on these bales of hay and would have listened to his professors. You look at the Divine Comedy, it's filled with Thomas Aquinas, filled with the scholasticism he learned here. So it's always very moving to me to come to this spot and realize, the whole university movement, which starts in the 13th century, or at the very beginning of it here.
Aquinas' literary career lasted only about 25 years, but his productivity was nothing short of staggering. His collected works fill 50 double-columned folio volumes. Thomas was obviously a genius, but he was also a man of extraordinary order and discipline. His day began with 2 masses, one that he celebrated and a second at which he assisted. And it continued almost without interruption as a cycle of reading, teaching, and writing. It is said that he dictated different works to as many as 3 secretaries at once, turning from one to the other. He would take a brief nap in the middle of the day and would frequently dictate arguments in his sleep. He was famously absent-minded. They say that a brother Dominican was assigned to sit next to him at meals to make sure he didn't put anything inedible in his mouth.
One of the best-known anecdotes about Thomas Aquinas concerns a dinner he attended at the table of King Louis IX of France, St. Louis. In the midst of a raucous conversation, Thomas sat in abstracted silence, as usual, lost in thought. And then suddenly he brought his meaty fist down on the table, shook all the cups and plates, disturbed all the diners around him. And he said, "That will settle the Manichees." He just formulated an argument against the dualist heresy of Manichaeism. But one of his Dominican brothers turned to him
and said rather sternly, "Don't you realize you're at the king's table?" But the saintly king, far more concerned with truth than decorum, said, "No, no, send a scribe immediately and take down the friar's argument, lest he forget it." No account of Thomas Aquinas' life would be complete without some reference to the events that immediately preceded his death. When he was in Naples, December the 6th, 1273, the feast of St. Nicholas, Thomas was saying Mass in the presence of his friend Reginald, and something extraordinary happened during that Mass. For afterward, Thomas Aquinas broke his routine of 25 years, and he said, "I cannot write anymore." When pressed on the matter, he simply said, "I cannot. Everything I've written seems like straw compared to what's been revealed to me." After filling thousands of pages with words, the great master abruptly fell silent. What happened to Thomas Aquinas? There's some evidence of a physical dimension to the experience. He took to his bed soon after, and when his sister saw him, she described him as stupefactus, dazed or out of his senses. That doesn't begin to explain it. Thomas saw something. In January of 1274, the Pope asked Thomas to attend the Council of Lyon. And despite his failing health, he set out on the journey. But on the way, he became desperately ill. He was taken first to a castle, but Thomas said, "I don't want to die in a secular place." Well, the closest religious house was this Cistercian abbey of Fossanova. He was brought to this very room. Some say that during his last days, he dictated a commentary on the Song of Songs. It was here, just behind me, that Thomas died on March the 7th, 1274. Sometimes I think God does speak in a much more direct, unambiguous way. You see it in great biblical figures. You see it throughout the history of the church. And yes, in people like Catherine of Siena and Thomas Aquinas. Now, how do you determine the difference between that experience and let's say someone who's just schizophrenic or just crazy and they're hearing voices? Then you've got to look at the totality of a person's life. Was Thomas Aquinas a deeply troubled, strange, anxiety-filled, problematic figure? No, he was by all accounts a very integrated, centered, balanced person. And so you look at the totality of the life and say, well, I don't think this is schizophrenia or some mental illness. I think this guy is witnessing to a real experience that he had. So I think the voice of God issue, you can read it a lot of ways, more generically, more symbolically and metaphorically, and in some cases very directly. There was a study done some years ago, and the conclusion of it was, America is a nation of mystics. And the author meant, you scratch the surface of most people's lives, you'll find lots of reports of this kind of strange, mystical encounter with higher powers. So we can say, oh, the person's nuts, but an awful lot of people have had these extraordinary experiences. So I think that's probably the right way to contextualize it.
We recall the question raised by the very young Thomas Aquinas. But Master, what is God? I think it's fair to say the answering of that question became the principal obsession of Thomas's life. A curious feature of his doctrine of God is how agnostic it is. Thomas is much more likely to tell you what God is not than what God is. Though he wrote, as we saw, thousands of pages about God, he always honored St. Augustine's dictum, si comprehendus, non est Deus. If you understand, that isn't God.
The great temptation is to turn God into a supreme version of a creature, to think of him as one being, however exalted among many. Thomas clarifies that God is not a being. He's not in any genus, even that most generic of genera, namely existence. Rather, God is, in Thomas's pithy Latin phrase, ipsum esse subsistens, the sheer act of to be itself. God is not an item in the universe or alongside it. Rather, he's the reason why the contingent and evanescent universe exists at all. Atheists, both old and new, rather consistently miss this point. When they find no evidence for this supreme being, they confidently declare that there's no God. But they're mistaking God, as Thomas understands him, with the gods, supreme items within the realm of nature. The true God is the answer to the question, why is there something rather than nothing?
Thomas sums this up by applying to God a term that belongs properly to God alone, namely simplicity. Now, we tend to construe this term in precisely the wrong way, thinking it means something elementary or undeveloped. What Thomas means is that God is the sheer act of being itself, not this or that type of thing. Being without restriction and without limitation. In creatures, there's a distinction between what Thomas calls essence, what it is, and existence, that it is. So, for example, I'm a being, but I'm a human being, a being of a very particular type. This camera into which I'm gazing right now is a being of a very definite technological type. The trees around me are beings of a botanical type. But none of this obtains in regard to God. There is in God no distinction between essence and existence. To be God is to be to be. You see how this is just a more philosophically precise reformulation of the great answer that God gave to Moses when the patriarch asked, "What's your name?" And God said, "I am who I am."
As the simple reality, God is that whose being is unconditioned, unrestricted, unlimited. This is why Thomas speaks of God as infinite, without borders. It's also why he's described as immaterial. It's not as though God is less than material. Rather, his being transcends the limits inherent in a material manner of existence. This is also why God is referred to as eternal. Time conditions material things, but God stands outside of time. Thomas also speaks of God as immutable or unchangeable. This has nothing to do with impassivity in the psychological sense. It means that God cannot improve or move from an inferior to a superior state. Instead, he's utterly perfect and fulfilled in his manner of being. Perhaps you've noticed by now that this procedure is largely negative. Thomas telling us what God is not rather than what God is. What does it mean to be immaterial, eternal, infinite, immutable? Well, we really don't know, for nothing in our ordinary experience is like that.
Nevertheless, real spiritual insights can be gleaned from these reflections. To say that God is immutable is to say that he's reliable. He doesn't pass in and out of emotional states. He doesn't fall in and out of love with the world that he's made. To say that he's eternal is to say that he's not stuck in any particular moment of time, and therefore is present to all moments of time. To say that God is immaterial is to say he's not restricted to any one place, but can therefore be present to all places.
But is the God of Thomas Aquinas personal? Yes. Since he's in possession of all the perfection of existence, he must have mind, will, and freedom. God knows and loves himself first, and then knows and loves all that participates in his being. His knowledge of the world is not passive and derivative, but rather creative. Things exist because God knows them into being. This is why the 139th Psalm is right. Lord, you search me and you know me. You know when I sit and stand. You understand my thoughts from afar. My travels and my rest you mark. With all my ways you are familiar. God's love follows from his knowing. For to know something as good is ipso facto to will it, to rest in it, to savor it. God loves his own perfection with an absolutely perfect love. This love is so intense that it spills over. Creation is nothing but the fruit of this effervescent love.
I talked a lot about Thomas's view of God as not a thing in the world, not a thing at all, not a being at all, but being itself. This is so important for the debates going on right now, because you read the great atheists, people like Feuerbach and Marx and Freud and Sartre, and now read their disciples today, the new atheists so-called. They all share this in common. They all think of God as some big being. Some say he exists, some say he doesn't. I call it the Yeti theory of God. Some say there's a Bigfoot, others say there isn't. Let's go find out. Let's look for evidence. See, but the problem is the question set up entirely the wrong way. The creator of the universe is not an item within the universe. Think of the Russian cosmonaut that goes up, in the 1950s, goes up into space and says, hey, I've gone up in the heavens and there's no God. Well, see, that's precisely the wrong way to look for God. You don't find him as one more thing in the universe. Rather, God is the condition for the possibility of the existence of contingent things. That's a fancy way of saying that God is the sheer act of being itself, in and through which all finite things find their existence. And so part of the problem with atheism is it sets up the question the wrong way. If they knew what Thomas Aquinas meant by God, they wouldn't ask the question that way.
What makes Thomas Aquinas perhaps most relevant to our time is his approach to the issue of faith and reason. For many rationalists today, faith is simply credulity or superstition or gullibility, believing things on the basis of no evidence. It would certainly be anachronistic to say that Enlightenment-style rationalism was in vogue in the 13th century. Nevertheless, a form of rationalism was indeed prevalent in the Paris of Thomas's time, namely Latin Averroism. This was a westernized version of the theory of Averroes, the Islamic philosopher, who would argue that theology represents relatively primitive thought, appropriate for the unsophisticated, whereas philosophy is the speech of the intellectual elite.
What this gave rise to in its Western Latin form was a double truth theory, whereby something could be true theologically but false philosophically, and vice versa. Traces of this view can be found in the present day, for one of the upshots of Latin Averroism is that finally faith and reason have nothing to do with each other. At the end of the day, faith is simply irrational. This is precisely what Immanuel Kant and his enlightened colleagues thought, and why they encouraged people of faith to grow up intellectually.
Well, Thomas Aquinas was having none of this. He stood passionately and resolutely against Latin Averroism and the double truth theory, insisting that faith and reason cannot come into conflict with one another precisely because they come from the same source, the God who is truth itself. For Thomas, faith is not below reason, not infra-rational. Rather, it stands above reason, supra-rational. It is not opposed to reason, but goes beyond it. Its darkness comes not from an insufficiency of light, but from an excess of light. But this means that reason can explore the faith with complete freedom. There's no sacrificium intellectus, no sacrifice of the mind involved in authentic religious faith.
I realize that when you talk about Latin Averroism, it can sound like something so sophisticated only specialist historians might be interested, but there's a huge resonance. The basic idea was that faith and reason split apart. So this view had it that something could be true theologically, but false philosophically. True according to faith, but false according to reason. Was the Aquinas sense right away? It's a very dangerous thing, because now faith and reason just become unmoored. Some people of faith, even to the present day, will accept that view. Say, hey, this is what I believe. Don't ask me any questions. I'm not open to criticism. I know science and reason say this, but my faith says that. It's a fideism. On the other side, you've got a rationalism that says, well, faith is just a lot of old nonsense, a lot of old superstition, and reason, science teach something else. Faith and reason have drifted apart. Thomas Aquinas, back in the 13th century in this city, sensed the danger of this, because he knew that God is the truth. Jesus says, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. If God is the truth, then anything true, whether it's mathematical truth, scientific truth, philosophical truth, is from God. And therefore, it can't be at odds finally with faith, which is from God. So he kept the two of them together, which I think is enormously important. Whenever faithful people are tempted to say, oh, don't ask any questions, whenever scientific people are tempted to say faith is a bunch of nonsense, Thomas Aquinas stands athwart those two positions and brings them back together. One of the most signal contributions of Thomas Aquinas was in the area of theological anthropology, to give it its technical description. More simply, his understanding of the human person. What strikes you first about Thomas in this area is how anti-dualist he was. Aquinas was much more at home with the biblical idea of the unity of the person than he was with all those forms of Platonic dualism that dominated Christian thought before him.
For Thomas, the soul is not an alien power standing over and against the body, nor an unhappy spirit imprisoned in the body. Rather, it is the form of the body, the energy that makes a body distinctively human. This statement from the Summa is typical. The whole human soul is in the whole body, and also in every part of the body, just as God is present to the entire universe. Also this, the soul is in the body, not as contained by it, but as containing it. One upshot of this unifying view is that the body should be reverenced. Here again from Thomas. We ought to cherish the body. Our body's substance is not from an evil principle, but from God. And therefore, we ought to cherish the body by a friendship of love.
So Thomas is not a dualist. But didn't he believe in the immortality of the soul? Well, indeed he did, because the soul's intellectual capacity, its ability to engage in properly abstract thinking, is a sign of its immateriality. Nevertheless, he was convinced that in heaven, body and soul come together. Here's his own language. At the resurrection, the soul resumes not a celestial body or the body of some animal, but a human body made up of flesh and bones. Heaven is not a place of pure spirit. It's an embodied place, because no human soul would ever be perfectly happy apart from a human body.
Another key dimension of Thomas's anthropology is his biblically based conviction that the human being is made in the image and likeness of God. This has nothing to do with physical resemblance, for God is not material. It has to do with the curiously infinite capacity of the mind and the will. The mind is never satisfied by any of the particular truths of the sciences or philosophy. It wants to know the truth itself. The will is never satisfied by any particular good. It wants the good itself. In a word, both mind and will are ordered to God. By nature, we are ordered to something beyond nature. And from this paradox flows much of the drama and poetry of the human condition. The human being is made for ecstasy, for the journey into God.
Thomas referred to theology as a science. Well, look at the sciences that begin, in the 16th century. And of course, we're still asking all kinds of questions. The sciences have a way of opening up. As you answer one question, 10 new ones emerge. The same is true of the science of theology. So the best minds of the time in the Middle Ages went in for theology, as the best minds probably today go in for the sciences. You have the best minds of a given era looking at these questions, they're going to find all sorts of things to explore. And when you read the text of Thomas Aquinas, they're breathtaking. You can see the autographs of Aquinas, that crabbed writing of his, but the detail of his mind and the nature of the analysis is just extraordinary. He was a genius. It's a bit like an Einstein or a Newton or a Kant or a Plato. He was a genius within the structure of his time intellectually. Though it's overlooked in most treatments of Thomas Aquinas, the great Dominican saint is best characterized, I think, as someone deeply in love with Jesus Christ. You can sense it in his devotion to the Eucharist and to the other sacraments. You see it too in his rather extraordinary mystical experience, but perhaps most clearly in his writings on Jesus, which I think are the linchpin to his whole thought. There's a text in the third part of the Summa Theologiae. I've always found it very moving and very clarifying. The topic under consideration is the appropriateness or fittingness of the incarnation. Aquinas says something is fitting in the measure that it's congruent with your nature. Thus, it's fitting for me now to be speaking to you because I'm a rational animal. Well, God's nature is to be the good. And as the ancient adage had it, bonum diffusivum sui. That means the good is diffusive of itself. It gives itself away. When you're in a good mood, you don't turn inward, but rather you overflow, you effervesce, you go out of yourself. So we can see the supreme goodness of God in the sheer variety and fecundity of what he's made. God did not remain in isolated self-regard, but rather he gave himself away.
But if God is the absolutely highest good, then it would follow, it would be conveniens or fitting, that God would give himself in the fullest possible manner. And this, says Thomas, takes place when God joins to himself a created nature, becoming one with creation. The incarnation is therefore the surest and purest indication of God's goodness. We could sum this up by saying that the good God is ecstatic. He tends to stand out from himself, ecstasis, to move toward the other in love. But this fits perfectly with Thomas's reflections on the human person. For we saw earlier that human beings, by their nature, tend outward and upward, ecstatically reaching out toward the good and the true. Jesus Christ, the coming together of divinity and humanity, is accordingly the meeting of two ecstasies, a divine ecstasy that reaches down and a human ecstasy that reaches up. With the icon of Jesus Christ in mind, we can also understand with greater clarity one of Thomas's master ideas, namely that the true God and humanity are not in competition with one another.
Thomas says with the mainstream of the Catholic tradition that Jesus is the hypostatic or personal unity of two natures, divine and human, that come together without mixing, mingling, or confusion. Jesus is not quasi-human, quasi-divine like Hercules or Achilles, nor is he merely human like a great saint, nor merely divine as the Docetus would have it. Rather, he's truly human and truly divine, neither nature having to compromise itself to make way for the other. Now, can you see how this doctrine coheres with and indeed gives rise to Thomas's sense of God as ipsum esse, or being itself? If God were a supreme being, however great, he'd still be one finite nature among many, hence would compete with creatures. A supreme being could not become incarnate without compromising either himself or the integrity of the creature he becomes.
The God who does indeed give himself away utterly, becoming a creature, but without undermining himself or the creature he becomes, cannot be one being among many. What a beautiful and illuminating coincidence of teachings.
You know, Thomas's status as a thinker is kind of a complicated issue. Go back to the early 20th century, Bertrand Russell, the great philosopher, writes a history of philosophy. And he includes Thomas Aquinas, but he's a minor character. In fact, he closes the chapter by saying, I don't really understand his enormous reputation because he's just a competent commentator on Aristotle. That would be a very reductive, modern dismissal of Thomas Aquinas. At the same time, you've got some on the Catholic side that would probably so elevate Thomas as a philosopher. My point is this. He was indeed a philosopher, even a great one, but he's best read as a theologian. Above all, he wanted to use philosophy in service of a higher end, always to move people to Christ. So he's a complicated intellectual figure that way. You can isolate some of his writing and say, well, there's his philosophical work, and read it simply that way. But I think that violates his own spirit. I would rank Thomas Aquinas as one of the 4 or 5 greatest thinkers in the Western tradition. And that includes Plato, Aristotle, Kant, and some of the very best. But it's a complicated thing because he's both philosopher and theologian. But the very best way to read him is philosopher in service of theology.
Why is Thomas Aquinas a pivotal player? He showed as completely and passionately as anyone in the tradition that Christians could think deeply about their faith. For him, no question, even the most fundamental, was off limits. He demonstrated thereby that faith and reason are not in opposition to one another. That being a believer involves, as we saw, no sacrificium intellectus. In our time, when so many hold that religious people are simpletons and religious faith only a crude superstition, Thomas Aquinas remains more relevant than ever. He is also pivotal because he beautifully exemplified a truly Catholic mind, by which I mean a mind open to every and any influence, willing to embrace the truth wherever he found it. Thomas was inspired, of course, by the Bible and the great Christian theological tradition, but he also read and cited with enthusiasm the pagan philosophers Plato, Aristotle, and Cicero, the Jewish rabbi Moses Maimonides, the Muslim scholars Averroes, Avicenna, and Avicebron. Even when he disagreed with a thinker, as he did with Origen and Sige of Brabant, he always did so with respect and without polemics. In this, he's a wonderful model for our time, when the religious conversation is sadly so marked by rancor and vituperation.
Finally, he's pivotal in his understanding of God as non-competitively transcendent. The God of Thomas Aquinas, as we saw, is not a threat to human freedom and human integrity, but the very ground of that freedom and that integrity. Thomas Aquinas would agree with St. Irenaeus that the glory of God is a human being fully alive. At a time when so many people see God's existence as undermining the human project, how liberating and clarifying this doctrine is. The God of Thomas Aquinas is the God of the burning bush, that power whose proximity makes the world more beautiful and more radiant without consuming it.